Look, I'm back again. I've been asked at relatively short notice if I'd chair this event, and it's a pleasure to do so. As Natalie indicated in the Foot Forward NDSS DA ADS type project, I'm helping to lead that, and part of this topic actually does overlap with that. The Foot Forward program is for clinicians and people with diabetes and has one aim to focus on data collection. And of course, in anything where you're hoping to make a quality improvement difference, you need the cycle of care and you need the data. And that pertains to individual units, high-risk foot services in this case, and centres and healthcare districts, and then more nationally. So approaching 3 years ago now, when the high-risk foot services in Australia were progressed to the point of developing standards, the very next stage was also accreditation processes. And within the 8 standards of the National Association for Diabetes Centres High-Risk Foot Services is one key one, which is the data collection standard. Clearly, many high-risk foot services said they could do with some assistance in user-friendly processes for data collection. And out of that, this minimum data set has been born. You'll hear from Joel Lasschuit. It's also linked in with Diabetic Foot Australia methods. And Joel himself has really been the key person who's been pushing this particular item forward, for which NADC and I personally am very thankful. Joel is an endocrinologist from St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, and he co-leads the high-risk foot service and is dedicated to foot care in diabetes. More recently in this space, he's been contributing in particular to progression of the minimum data set and developing it for the NADC. And he also has an active interest at a local level in Sydney in SID-FIG, F-I-G. And it's not the one that you're saying, I don't give a fig, it's actually the foot interest group where people that attend certainly do give a fig. And we look forward to that meeting, which is a collaborative, clinical collaborative, to it progressing further within Sydney and beyond. So without further delay from me, we welcome you, Joel, for your presentation on implementing collection of the high-risk foot service minimum data set into our clinics. And we're quite happy to make this an interactive process as well. Maybe Joel can give the background initially, and then if you have any questions as we go along, we may well be able to address them. We've got, about 30 minutes, I think, Joel, so let's see how we go.
Thank you very much, Stephen. You always give me a kind introduction, and I think perhaps this is obviously a fairly specialised area within diabetes, but a lot of, I think, what we've gone through could be rolled out in other areas, and really the messages here are just about how to, as much as possible, implement user-friendly ways of data collection in our services. So if we can use this as an example, perhaps. So I'm just going to give a brief history as to how I ended up getting involved. And for people that have either seen me present on this area in ADC or DFA, I do apologise that there will be a fair bit of overlap. But we started our high-risk foot service about 11 years ago now with a modest donation. And since then, we were able to start collecting data through Excel spreadsheets. And I think anyone in the audience who's done this would know that there's a lot of issues with this style of data collection in terms of missing data and just the clunky nature of having to enter data after clinics. It's not always very practical. So we had a need in our service that we demonstrated in a published audit, that we had a rapidly increasing service with regard to case numbers and complexity, and we needed a better way of being able to conduct future audits without having to rely on going back to paper records to try to extract that information. And that's really where we looked out to multiple different ways of collecting data. And REDCap, which a lot of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, I'll hopefully make you familiar with it today, is a really kind of user-friendly way and efficient way of collecting data. So we looked at that, and then alongside was when the accreditation committee, as Steve already mentioned, had identified that a lot of services were struggling with data collection, and we thought we could use this model in some capacity for high-risk foot services nationally. So we've now, since April, been using REDCap at the patient side and actually inputting data as we conduct our clinics. And this is a really nice way of doing it, but not always going to be practical for other services. So we've had to consider that. So why REDCap? It's free, it's accessible across Australia and the world, although I do appreciate, as we've found, that not all hospitals have REDCap available. It's user-friendly, and it's a web-based interface, so I can actually access patient data no matter where you are in the globe, but it is also secure. It allows for real-time auditing, and I'll show you how powerful this can be. And there's also extraction into any database, into any statistical software that's commonly used. It's really customizable. So while we're going to help services set up the minimum data set, they'll inevitably have their own areas of interest that they're wanting to collect data in, and they will be able to do that. It will be customizable. And as an example, just there, we're doing a study at the moment that we've used the minimum data set and then added a form to be able to collect the relevant things that we needed to for that particular study. And the features are endless, really. It's just up to the imagination. So what we've done is we've used our REDCap in a way to collect data at the patient side, but then use that to actually generate correspondence. So it's a single point of electronic entry, and you get your letter out of it, you get your patient's notes out of it, plus you collect data all in one go. And I think that's really why it's worked for us. But most importantly, this data will be owned by the service. They'll have complete control over what they're collecting as long as the minimum data set is a part of that. And then that minimum data gets hopefully collated at a national level for benchmarking and audits. So where we're up to. So basically the minimum data set review, as Steve said, was undertaken by predominantly the accreditation committee with a lot of input obviously through NADC and ADATS, and also Diabetic Foot Australia, who've already published some information around what should be collected by high-risk foot services. And we've been through the process now of asking services to put their hands up to pilot and try this out. And really what this involves is at a local level, identifying who organises in your institution the REDCap server and getting them to add the project and the users. But in terms of the actual setup, I'll show you how we've managed to keep that very simple if you're interested in using this. In tandem, we're suggesting that services start talking to their ethics committee about what local requirements there would be to collect data using REDCap. And in particular, there will be obviously some questions around when it comes time to annual extraction for the NADC, what particular data transfer agreement might need to be in place. So my role is really, once I'm added as a REDCap user into your local project, I basically go in, set everything up, set up all the tools, so it's very straightforward and easy for you to get started. And I am blind to any data that's collected. So any patient information I will not be able to see. My role there is purely to help manage and set things up. And then it also allows me to help troubleshoot and provide periodic updates as time goes on. Of course, we're going to find that we've missed things and maybe added things that we didn't need, and so there will be some flexibility. And really, it's only once this second process is complete in terms of the ethics side that you can start collecting real data. But I think just in terms of the blue line arrows up the top there, we can already go through all of this and get people up and running, playing around with it, adding in fake data so they feel comfortable, and then once the ethics comes through, the real data collection can start. So we're certainly encouraging any services, particularly high-risk foot services, to log into this website here, complete the expression of interest, and at this stage really towards the development status, which just means it's using mock data initially while we wait for the local ethics to come on board. And you send the completed expression of interest through to this email address, admin@nadc.net.au, and that allows me to help you get things up and running. We have found, obviously, that there's this is, unfamiliar to services. How do we use REDCap? What kind of ethics and governance is required? So we have got information that we then send out to services to assist in this process. And this is kind of where we're up to at the moment. We've got 9 sites that have already started this process in terms of setting up their data, and there's another 8 or so who are kind of in the process of working through the expression of interest application. And I'm also working on a set of slides which will really help people in a very picture type way exactly how you use the data set, but hopefully also I'll be able to provide some advice by email and phone. And I think there's ongoing discussions that are becoming obvious as we've started rolling this out. So one is that there are hospitals, even though REDCap is free to any institution, it does require a degree of local support. And some hospitals have found difficulty in having REDCap set up at their local institutions. So we may need to then look at what alternatives could be in place. And there are already existing ways of collecting data within a lot of institutions. And as long as the data sets are aligned, there's no reason why we can't all be using, different platforms as long as we're all aligned in what we're actually collecting at the end of the day. And then the formalisation of data transfer is certainly something which ethics departments are very interested in, and we're going to have to work through that in some detail. So this is where, thank you. I'm having some help in just opening. So what I'm going to show you now is just what it looks like, so you get an idea of how it works. Thank you. So just out of interest, how many people in the audience have already used REDCap for something or know they have REDCap available? Okay, yeah. The hardest part's usually remembering your login. Okay, so here we go, NADC. So just a run through of kind of what functionality we have. So this is all obviously built into REDCap, so you'll be quite familiar with this. I think I'll just show you record status dashboard. So here's just an example of a few different patients we've had entered in to our REDCap database. And I'll just show you a couple of quirks. So number 1 here, if we open them up, you can see as time goes on, episodes of care, which is basically the time between the patient landing in the high-risk foot service and then being discharged or transferred after completion of care. You can see the date range there. You can see the different tools that we've completed as part of that process, and you get a summary across the bottom just showing what ulcer was active at that first episode of care, what the outcome was for that particular ulceration, and now we're on to our second episode of care. It appears to be a recurrent ulcer. And if we go back, I'll show you number 2, a slightly different scenario where they're currently within their first episode of care. They've got multiple ulcerations. You can see from the dates very quickly that 2 of them were entered at the same time. That's probably the initial visit. They then subsequently developed another ulceration, and that's then dated accordingly. And you can see one of those ulcers, so number 2, is now healed. However, there's 2 ongoing, and you'll complete those when the time comes. Here's another example where we've got an individual who's receiving high-risk foot service care. They may then be transferred for the completion of that episode to a community centre or elsewhere to a different service. And this actually allows you to, in that scenario, basically compose a survey invitation or create an access code which you will send to the service taking over care, and that gives them a way of directly inputting those final data points so you don't miss anything when they've moved from your service. And once that data comes in, you'll be notified that that was complete. So there's a lot of flexibility in the way that you can collect data on REDCap. There's a few other very important tools, I think. So one is in terms of, actually I'll show you data quality first. So there's a lot of easy to use tools such as missing values. So just by selecting that, you can suddenly see any fields that were not filled in. And so that's a quick way of making sure you haven't left data out. And so you can work through those. You can also really rapidly have a look at what your stats are doing. So for example, if we wanted to look at service stats, here we have, for example, the time from referral to initial assessment. So we can see the median there is around 3 days. We can see the breakdown of where our patients were referred from, and you can, make pretty pictures. But basically it just means that when you're sitting down as a service every month or so, you can actually rapidly assess where your service is up to and identify any gaps where service improvements may be required. Of course, there's also the annual data extract that's built in to de-identify automatically all your data before you transfer it out to the NADC, for example. So that is really the functionality there. I thought I might just, if time allows, I think we're going okay, just show you basically how we enter the data, because I think that's what everyone will care about the most. So here we are in add and edit records. Remember that all of the other functionality is set up for you. So when you first use REDCap, you'll basically be able to jump straight into this section, add a new record. Here's record number 5. This, patient's new, so we're going to start by filling out their demographics. You simply click on the dot, and while you can fill it in this way, it's much nicer if we enter what's called the survey format, which just looks pretty, but it also is a lot easier to have a look at. So I'm just going to put in some essential data fields here, otherwise we won't be able to progress. But basically, we're after gender, ethnicity, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander status. So it's just a matter of obviously clicking the relevant fields. And some dates here required. And again, just literally clicking through. So the idea with this initial data set would be that at the beginning of that episode of care, perhaps at the end of the day, when you see, which were my new patients for that day, you can then enter them into your database. So it's a single point of entry. So you work through that. A lot of these fields, you'll see there's like a little last recorded thing there. So if they've already been known to your service, a lot of this data will then be accessible directly. It'll come up there. You can, in case of complications, you're able to select multiple, for example, and you basically just work through. So we've got previous foot ulceration, previous amputation. Some of these fields open up. So if you say they've had a previous amputation, it asks you what the level of the amputation was. Comorbidities, smoking status, EGFR, dialysis. And then it comes to ulcers. So, for example, if we just enter some ulcer characteristics here, I'm just going to say it's a right-sided hallux ulcer On the dorsal aspect, you would enter in the size of the ulcer and the cause and whether it's recurrent or not. And then it will ask whether there's any other ulcers. Let's say in this scenario there isn't. Then we're back to this page. We see we've completed now their initial set of data, and we can see the summary of the ulcer that we've recorded. At the completion of that episode of care, so we tried to keep it quite simple because we realised services don't have time for every single time the patient is there to actually enter data. So rather than having to perform this at every single point, it's only if there's a new ulceration or a change in the ulcer status that you would then update. So for example, down the track, we have a new ulcer, we click here, add new instance, and you fill out the same thing for the next ulcer. And then that would then be, that would then come up down here as well. And then at the end, simply just select the management, interdisciplinary input, whether antibiotics were required, offloading, hospitalisation, the date when they left the service, and what happened to the patient. And then it will ask you for the individual ulcers, whether they healed or were not healed or were amputated. So that is basically what is involved, and that would be the end of that episode. Obviously, then if the patient comes back for a second episode of care, a lot of those fields that won't change will then be there already filled in, so you don't need to kind of double up. But that's the model that we've come up with using REDCap for high-risk foot services, and I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience who are not necessarily involved in high-risk foot services, but hopefully it's just an idea of a free way of hopefully streamlining data collection in other areas as well. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions about how we got to this point, where we're going from here, and any comments as well. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joel, and thanks for your attention as an audience. We do have a roving microphone, and so Natalie's controlling that, and so if you can work off that in terms of your questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi there. Just wondering, is there any fields for a Charcot foot without an ulceration?
Great question. So this is when we were looking at what was really going to be the minimum data set. There was a decision at this time point that we were going to concentrate on ulceration as a first step. I imagine that maybe after a year, when every service is comfortable with using the REDCap to collect data in this way, we may then expand to include a form on Charcot. And of course, there's a lot of functionality within REDCap to collapse areas that are not applicable. So it would be as easy as adding a field that says, is the patient coming for ulceration, Charcot, or maybe a combination? And the irrelevant sections would then not be needed to fill out, so it would collapse all that down. So certainly that functionality will probably come. The other thing just to mention though is if your service is particularly interested in Charcot outcomes, as we all are, you could add a form in for your service to collect those particular fields already. So that is an option and it's completely customisable, and I'd be very happy to even help with that if services wanted.
Thanks, Joel. I'm Sherry. I'm actually a dietitian, but I really find that this dynamic database is awesome, and I just wondered whether there's opportunities for it to be integrated through a multidisciplinary team, like in other aspects of management.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I didn't show you the REDCap design that we have that we're using at St Vincent's. It's a lot more complicated than this. I think this database has about 60 fields. Ours has about 600. A lot of it is expandable and collapsible depending on what's relevant. But in there is things like nutritional screening, for example, where patients with chronic ulceration do have that input, and we're able to record whether we have particular vitamin deficiencies or concerns that we've picked up. And so there is the opportunity is there, and I guess for us, it was trying to find something which was going to be uniformly useful across high-risk foot services. And again, if you are involved with a local high-risk foot service, you could then add in some fields that are relevant to your area of specialty. So yeah, I think the option's there.
Hello?
Yep. Okay, sorry, I've got another question.
Yeah, sure.
Can you give us some examples of what you've used the data for your service and team and improvements?
Yeah. I don't have anything, prepared here that I can show you, but so basically the way we've implemented it into our service, because keeping in mind that ours is a lot more involved, I guess, in terms of the depth of data collection, purely because we're also using it as a clinical record tool and correspondence generating tool. So it is a bit of a different scenario. So what we're doing is every new patient that comes into the service will get entered in, but existing people are still, we're just using the standard way, because otherwise we're suddenly having to enter every single person in the service into it, and it'll become too cumbersome. So that's a long way of saying that in terms of audit, since we've only been going since April, we haven't got enough people that are in our service that have yet actually been entered into the database to conduct a useful audit. The previous audit we published was just based on our Excel data. But I can give you an example where we've already used it in a research application, which is we're looking at wound photography in terms of depth and area devices to monitor wounds. And so we've simply used the NADC minimum data set and added on a field for us to do to enter in our ruler wound measurements to compare with the device that we're trialling. And in that way, we're able to rapidly assess where our recruitment is up to, the kind of distribution of recruits that we already have in that trial. And so we do look at that quite commonly, and we also use it to check that we're up to date with data entry using those tools I've already shown you. So I think the way that I can see this being quite useful is that the minimum data set that really I think most research would want to include is already there, and then you just add on an extra form for the specific area that your research is looking at, and it's a really rapid way of coming up with a complete data set in a user-friendly way. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't have anything graphical to show you, unfortunately. Yeah.
Hang on, Liz, I'm coming.
How are you putting it into your electronic medical records? And then something that's just come up, how is the electronic medical records administrations able to data mine it to get their information that they want out of, so
Okay.
to EMR?
Yeah, so the way it's currently working, so St Vincent Sydney has a different EMR to everywhere. So it's probably not going to be a broadly applicable answer, because I don't know how other services would do that. What we do is we're at the point of now actually creating like a sticker thing that we can put in the paper record. But right now we're actually writing basically the attendees of that particular interdisciplinary clinic, the time and date, of course, and then just literally stating that the electronic record's been uploaded on our MediWeb, which is probably like an EMR type thing, and then writing our recommendations in the paper notes still, just a list recommendation, because in the 24 hours it takes for us to extract the letters and then have them uploaded into our electronic system, the patient may end up in emergency. And so at least there's some degree of documentation what the recommendations were from that clinic in that to capture that. So that basically the extract, which is the letter that we send out to all clinicians involved with that patient's care, also is comprehensive enough to form the patient notes. That then gets uploaded by the administration officer into our electronic system, and that's accessible across the hospital. So it would be equivalent to having it uploaded in Cerner under like a clinical document section. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, just brief comments on that. The functionality may well be there, but it will get back to your hospital and LHD. So, for example, we're next door at Sydney LHD, RPA Hospital, and REDCap is specifically for research at this stage, rather than having that clinical component, which would be very valuable. It might improve efficiencies. Thanks.
Hello.
Joel Nolan. Is there any capacity to upload photographs of ulcers, etc., into this?
Yeah. So, yeah, good question. So there's a lot of extra fields you can add in. So photographs is one. One is that we use all the time is actually our patient consent. So we actually have the PDF consent as a click option at the beginning of this survey, and then one of those when you get your mail from the postie, you sign with your finger to say that you've accepted the consent, and that's then stored electronically. And it's the same for photographs. So we can take photographs and it stores it within the REDCap. The only downside to that, and we've been encouraged actually locally based on our server capacity to not import the photographs into REDCap, because we'll run out of space pretty quickly because they'll be high resolution photographs. So we've paired this with our new ulcer photograph technology that also allows us to do depth and area calculations rapidly, and that stores photographs anyway in a cloud system. So that's the way we've worked around it. It is possible, but I think it'll come down to server capacity. Yeah, so I would love to link our Cerner equivalent and the wound photography and this all into one system, and even, for example, having automatic import of pathology results and things like that. And that's all possible, but REDCap's a free system as long as you are customising it within your capabilities. The minute you want to integrate with other systems, then REDCap will, they require payment to do that. And so at this stage, because we don't have budget for those kinds of things, we've kept it quite simple.